Clint Johnson, we're back to our guest of honor. He's a native of Florida and a graduate of the University of Florida journalism program. And if I got anything wrong, please feel free to correct me right on the spot, okay? So far, so good. He now resides in Ashe County, North Carolina, which is a beautiful place in the western part of our state. His wonderful wife joins him too. And what kind of pets do you all have? Pets, I heard you have pets.
Well, we had to put our cat down a couple weeks ago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. He's the only one left.
What's his name?
Griffin.
Okay. Wonderful. So Clint is an illustrious journalist, and he's an author of numerous books. You can see some of the titles there. He is a great speaker. He's been a guest of our roundtable through the years. This is what, your fourth time now, Clint?
I think so.
At least fourth time. So we're in for a real treat. So please join me in welcoming Clint tonight. This is for the online audiences. So.
How many of you have heard about the attack on New York City before tonight? So, well, about a third of you have heard about it. This would have been the worst terrorist attack in world history had it worked. It was carried out, but the results did not work out. And that's called the Confederates were very terrible terrorists. And I don't mean that they were evil terrorists, they were just lousy at doing it. And so that's part of the whole story here, because some of this will make no sense. Okay, Manhattan in 1864. New York City was only Manhattan. All of the other boroughs were all their own separate cities. But this is what Manhattan looked like from St. Paul's, which is near Fulton and Vesey, looking south. You can see that's the church. That's Wall Street down across from the church in the distance. This is a contemporary what Manhattan looked like. Manhattan in those days, you had ships on either side, both on the East River and the Hudson River. It was the most biggest city in the United States. It had 814,000 residents just in Manhattan, and that was 265,000 more than Philadelphia. And 1/4 of the residents were Irish who had come over here from the potato famine. And Brooklyn was the nation's third largest city, but it was less than a third of the size of Manhattan. The Trinity Church at 281 feet was the tallest point in the city of New York. And even then, though it was a tourist attraction, Stonewall Jackson took both of his wives up to the top of Trinity Church just to see it, because New York City was a place to see at that time. It was a very prosperous city. Yeah, next. Even though the loss of the South's cotton trade was made up by shipping wheat overseas and war material, merchants like A.T. Stewart and Brooks Brothers filled Army clothing contracts. New York shipworks and iron foundries worked around the clock. Manhattan was then, just as it is today, probably the most important city in the United States, which makes it even more interesting had it been destroyed. Go back one. Yeah, it's political and business leaders. New York City was a southern city. The mayor of New York, Fernando Wood, even suggested that New York City secede from the state of New York and the United States so it could be its own city, so it could trade with internationally and with the South at the same time. New York City shut down abolitionist talk. Abolitionists were beat up, run out of town, because New York at that time, anything before 1860, really thought it depended on the South and the cotton trade. And right up through 1860, one of the largest commercial enterprises in New York City was outfitting slave ships. They would outfit them with things to keep slaves in irons, outfit them to go over to Africa, and they were bringing not slaves back to the United States, but bringing them to the Caribbean. There was a famous case where the sailors of a ship went to Africa thinking they were going on a commercial venture. Turned out they were going to go on a slaving venture. They mutinied, brought the ship back, thought they'd be treated as heroes. They were tried for mutiny and put in jail. rather than doing what was the right thing, which is fighting the slave trade. 1860, Lincoln lost Manhattan's vote by almost 2-1, both in 1860 and 1864. They actually sent a delegation down to President Lincoln saying, can't we reach a compromise with the South? This will really hurt the city if the South secedes. Next. Spring of 1864, Grant's grinding away at Lee. Sherman's pushing his way through Georgia. Northern cities are starting to see large casualty lists, more than what they had. And they really began to question the wisdom of continuing the war. And Lincoln at that point really thought he was going to be defeated. And so we had the 1864 congressional elections coming up. And so the Confederates were trying to figure out a way to take advantage of that discontent. And they believed that Lincoln was going to get reelected, was up for reelection in 1864 too, as well as congressional. So the political thinking was that Lincoln himself didn't think he could get reelected. So the South began to say, what else can we do to make sure Lincoln is not elected? So the Confederates created a new organization to achieve that goal, and they called it Confederate Secret Service. And it was headed by a man named former Representative Jacob Thompson of Mississippi. And they set up an office in Toronto. Canadians had no objection to that. They did not officially approve of it, but they did not object to it. So there were several strategies for unseating Lincoln. Some of them sound too crazy to be believed. Davis, listening to some advisors, believed that Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio were just waiting to create their own Northwest conspiracy. Davis believed that there was at least 250,000 men just in those three states that were willing to support the Confederacy. That's 3 times the size of Lee's army at its largest. So the whole idea that this Northern conspiracy was possible, it was just a pipe dream, but Davis believed it. Another possibility was freeing the prisoners at Camp Douglas on Chicago. And this is a photograph of the prisoners. And there's always one guy. You see this guy right there at the edge of the picture, everybody's very solemn, and this guy's waving his hat, saying, look at me, look at me. But there must be 1,000 men in that picture right there. So they actually did try, they hijacked some ships and tried to go to Chicago with the idea that they would shell the outskirts of Camp Douglas and free those prisoners. That idea didn't work. Okay. The second strategy was electing a peace candidate. And George McClellan was going to be running against Lincoln as a Democrat, but McClellan made it clear that he believed Lincoln was following the right strategy. So the peace candidate idea didn't work. So they had no second war front in Indiana. The friendly Democrat candidate was not going to be left to unseat Lincoln. So they settled on the idea of demoralize the Union home front by threatening it with the promise of terror. Okay. This is some of the things that I never could figure out, couldn't find any research, but the South told the North that we're going to create a terror attack on the North. On October 15th, 1864, the Richmond Whig published an editorial directly threatening northern cities. 3 days later, the New York Times reprinted the editorial right on their front page, but without comment. So you can see it's talking about if we were asked how to create a terror in the North, if such a thing could be done, nothing would be easier. $1 million would lay the proudest city of the enemy in ashes. The men to execute the work are already there. There would be no difficulty in finding there, here, or in Canada suitable persons to take charge of the enterprise and arrange its details. 20 men with plans all preconcerted and means provided, selecting some dry, windy night, might fire Boston in 100 places and wrap it in flames from center to suburb. They might retaliate on Richmond, Charleston, etc. Let them do so if they dare. It is a game at which we can beat them. New York is worth 20 Richmonds. They have a dozen towns to our one, meaning a dozen large cities to our one large Richmond. To our one, and in their towns is centered nearly all of their wealth. It would be immoral and barbarous. It is not immoral or barbarous to defend yourself by any means. I don't know how many terrorists actually published their plans in advance, but that's what the Confederates did. And I never could figure out, was the Whig editorial a signal to the Confederates already in Canada, telling them, okay, now's the time to go? Why warn the northern cities of an attack? And why use a newspaper to send orders? Why not send couriers? And why give advance notice to the government that something's going to happen? The main goal of the Secret Service by October of 1864 was disruption of Lincoln's election and revenge on attacks against Southern civilians. You had the burning of Shenandoah Valley by Sheridan Custer. And then you had Sherman burned Atlanta. And so what these soldiers, eventually the agents, were teams of Confederate soldiers who had escaped from the Union prison camps. Their home base was in Toronto. And they had plans to attack Chicago, Boston, Cincinnati, and New York City. Now, the weapon that they started practicing with is Greek fire, which is a curious choice in that Greek fire, it's a real chemical weapon, but nobody has been able to duplicate it the way it was. In this image, you see them actually spraying it from a hose onto enemy ships. Okay? And so we don't really know by the Byzantines that they attacked their empire from the sea. We really don't know what the chemical components were. Chemical or Confederate Greek fire was probably a mixture of sulfur, pitch, dissolved niter, naphtha, and petroleum, kept in small glass vials. I had a high school buddy that's got a doctorate in chemistry from Yale, so I asked him, what's the properties of that stuff? He says, oh yeah, that stuff will burn. It burns instantly whenever exposed to air. And that's another mistake that the Confederates made. We'll get to that, okay? Yep. Okay, these are the two leaders. So Robert M. Martin on the left and John W. Headley on the right. They were the two leaders. They were part of John Hunt Morgan's Kentucky Cavalry, and they were some of the most trusted aides. They don't look at they're just 24 years old. But another interesting thing is they were brought to Jefferson Davis, ordered to come to see Jefferson Davis in person. And so he personally ordered them to go from Virginia to Canada, rather than recruited in Canada. So these two were not prisoners. So somehow they were decided that they were going to be the leaders, and they were going to go to Canada and pick up the other members of the team there. Now, Martin and Headley might have had a personal motivation. That was revenge for the murder of John Hunt Morgan. Had just been shot down unarmed in Greenville, Tennessee, just 10 weeks earlier. And Morgan has a very reputation among Confederate historians, but his men loved him. So they might have been motivated somewhat by that. 6 others, Morgan Raiders, joined the team. This guy is another thing you can't figure out. This is an outlier. Robert Cobb Kennedy. He was from Louisiana. He was not one of the members of the Kentucky Cavalry. Next slide. Alabama born, Louisiana raised, thick Southern accent, tossed out of West Point for disciplinary issues, hard-headed, hot-headed, and he had a very red face, and he limped from a war wound. He got it at Shiloh, I think. And he's prone to arguments when drinking. You know, everybody knows a mean drunk or did do a mean drunk in their past and their young. All right, so I always think James Bond is a lousy spy because everywhere he goes, everybody knows who he is. They recognize him as James Bond. This guy stands out. Red face, Southern accent, walks with a limp, gets into arguments with people. You know, this is not the guy you want to go undercover with. But for some reason, he was chosen and he went along with them. Okay, next slide. Oh, back up. Well, there's missing a slide there. All right, well, at any rate, there was very little plot planning in Toronto. This is, again, where the Confederates failed. There was a Toronto man named Larry McDonald who knew how to handle Greek fire, but the Confederates didn't train with it up there. McDonald did not go to New York City. He was going to have his brother beat him there. And Martin and Headley did not plan any of the operation themselves. They didn't go to New York City before they showed up there. They were just told what they would do. So there was no scouting of Manhattan targets at all. They just said, go to New York City and we'll figure it out from there. So Thompson, the head of the Secret Service, did all of this planning from Toronto himself. And Headley wrote a book about this after the war was over. Said Thompson assured him 20,000 men were enlisted in New York. Arms had been provided already for forces in the city. We would be expected to take military supervision of the forces at the vital moment. 20,000 New Yorkers that already weren't in service to the Union. You know, where were these? How were these guys escaping the Union draft? But somehow Thompson believed it somehow, and he convinced Headley and Martin about it. And they had several contacts. Next slide. Henry McDonald, Larry's brother, kept the Confederate trunks. They were shipped by train. They were most likely loaded with pistols. An unnamed white-bearded chemist living just west of Washington Square prepared the Greek fire in 144 little vials. I tracked down what I think was probably the chemist's home, because from the description in Headley's book, I forget the name of the park, but it's a park in Greenwich Village. If you, on the other side of the park, he talked about a row house that had two entrances going down into a basement level, and I found a building that matched that. One of them was a private residence, and one of them was a restaurant, at least at the time that I went there. And I looked in all of the directories looking for a chemist that would have been around there, and I couldn't find him. I had a guy that wrote me here last year, and he says, I think I found the guy. And he had done some research in finding a guy. The only difference is that man was described as being with a white beard and old, and the guy that he described was in his 20s. But another key to this was James McMaster. He was the editor of the Freeman's Journal and Catholic Digest. Now that sounds like a very detailed Catholic, he's a Catholic, but this was the largest selling nationwide newspaper at the time in 1864. Think of USA Today in its heyday. He had nationwide circulation in all of the states and territories. He hated the Lincoln administration because they had jailed him very early in the war for writing anti-administration editorials. Mean-looking guy, though, isn't he? Then Headley claimed in his book that Fernando Wood, who was former mayor of New York, and Benjamin Wood, his brother, were both U.S. congressmen at the time, and he said that they had advanced knowledge of the attack, as did the governor, Horatio Seymour, who also was an anti-Lincoln person. Now, can you imagine two U.S. congressmen and the governor of the state of New York being secret Confederates and hoping that you can take over New York, make New York a Confederate city? I said, no, a lot of this stuff doesn't make sense. This is what Headley claimed. And so in said in 1861, Wood had suggested the city free itself from the U.S. so it could trade with all countries. And Benjamin Wood regularly wrote, New York Daily News, regularly wrote anti-administration editorials. This is another weird thing. Headley said that the conspirators met Governor Seymour's personal secretary, McMaster's newspaper office, and that the secretary assured the Confederates that Seymour would not send state troops until Copperwood Army had taken control of the city. All right, that McMaster's office was right downtown Manhattan. Can you imagine being typesetter, 8 guys come in, speaking with Southern accents, one of them walking with a limp, and speaking to the editor of the newspaper in broad daylight, middle of the day? You know, why would you be, as a conspirators, talking to somebody right in their office? But apparently it happened. Well, because we do know that Seymour was no friend of the Republicans. In the July 1863 draft riots, Seymour came down to Manhattan and addressed the draft rioters, mostly the Irishmen, said, "My friends," and told them he would try and stop the draft of New Yorkers. And the New York Times accused Seymour at that time of being part of a plot to excite passion against the national government. Well, the plot continued on. Confederates arrived in New York City on October 27th. And on the same day that the New York Times carried a letter from Lincoln to Grant congratulating him on burning the Shenandoah Valley. I've read the letter, and it's pretty much, congratulating him for burning out the South, which these guys show up, read that in the newspaper. They say, all right, we're going to be getting our revenge. But, this is Thompson again, one thing the Confederate Secret Service was lousy at was keeping secrets. After the Confederates left Toronto, 2 different tips from Union spies warned the War Department. One of them was a spy for the War Department, and one of them was a spy for the State Department of an election day attack. Now, both Secretary of War Stanton and Seward, Secretary of State Seward, because they had gotten these reports from the spies, knew that Confederates from Canada were going to attack Union cities. So they recognized the danger, and they had notified the mayors of the targeted cities and the military commanders in those cities. So the federal government immediately acted on the intelligence it received. But the failure to stop the attack was all local. The November 4th New York Times ran a telegram from the Secretary of State to the mayor of Buffalo, not New York City. It says, this department has received information from the British provinces, Canada, to the effect there's a conspiracy on foot to set fire to the principal cities in the northern states on the day of the presidential election. It is my duty to communicate this information to you. W.H. Seward. All right, New York Times, long way away from Buffalo in those days. They didn't speculate, I don't wonder if New York City is going to be targeted. They printed the message went to Buffalo. So, why shouldn't they be warning their 814,000 citizens that they were the primary target? Just 1 month that the same newspaper had run the Richmond editorial. Local authorities did nothing to prepare for an attack that federal intelligence warned them was imminent. No advance warnings were given to any businesses. Even the local newspaper knew the attack was coming, but nothing was done. Now, New York Times editorial Henry Jarvis Raymond, on the left, intentionally did not warn the New Yorkers that they were potential targets. This guy had the same information because he just wrote it to the Buffalo. And New York Mayor Godfrey Gunfer, I don't know if he got the same telegram, but he should have known too. And in those days, this is the dig at the New York Times, because they're always anti-gun, anti-Second Amendment. They had their own Gatling guns. During the draft riots, the mayor, Raymond, bought 2 Gatling guns and installed them on top of the roof of the New York Times to shoot at the Irish protesters if they got close. Never were used. I'd love to know what happened to those Gatling guns. The next guy that paid attention to it, though, was Union General John Dix, who Fort Dix is named after. He was commanding the New York City district, and he took the telegraph warnings seriously. Now, here's a problem on military protocol. Lincoln, instead of giving all of the support to Dix, ordered 3,500 Union troops under Ben Butler to New York City, taking over Dix's department. All of y'all probably familiar with Ben Butler was not necessarily one of the brighter bulbs in the Union Army, and yet he was given command over New York City. So the Confederates saw all these Union troops coming in, and so, all right, let's not do anything on election day. So what did they do? They went sightseeing like anybody else that goes to New York City today. This is a Trinity Church, right down near Wall Street. They took in Henry Beecher Stowe's talks and generally just looked around the city and did the same things we would do if we grew up there. What they didn't do was practice with Greek fire. The idea that they were going to do was to set fire to hotel rooms. Each one was to check into a different hotel, into a different room, and set fire to the room. But they didn't practice with this stuff. Their only practice that they did was in Central Park, outside, in the daytime, outside of college, throwing it against the board. And at one point, a New York City police officer said, what are you guys doing? And they said, oh, we're just playing around with this stuff. Said, okay, that's good, thank you, and moved on. New York City cop could have stopped it right there. And they should have really scouted out better targets than the business class hotels. In those days, a lot of people lived in residential hotels in New York City. But then you also had the business class hotels. What do we think of a hotel today? Where people would come in and out for business. But some of their targeted places are the Astor House, which was the largest hotel in New York City. First hotel with an elevator. Davy Crockett came there and saw it, and he said, Mr. Astor must have killed a lot of beaver in order to build that hotel. You had the Fifth Avenue Hotel. And you had the St. James Hotel. St. James is real popular with Broadway actors. And you had the Hoffman House. That painting still exists, and it was scandalous in its day for showing naked women on a big painting. And so women were not allowed to go into the bar where this was displayed. Well, the Confederates got tired of waiting for something to happen, so I couldn't find it. So without any other motivation other than they got tired, they attacked on Friday, November 25th, around 8 o'clock. They did it at 8 o'clock because Friday, like in most towns, it's date night. So everybody was going to be out of their hotel rooms, seeing what the action was around in all of the place. So they had a terrorist attack without the intention of really hurting anybody. And this is actually a pretty representative picture of what they were doing. Now, they piled up linen, piled up chairs, put everything wooden. But the mistake was they poured it out. As I said before, this stuff, you throw it down, sudden exposure to oxygen, not artificial combustion, but instantaneous combustion. They poured it out. So it didn't catch fire the way they thought it would. They poured it out and then left the room. Okay? These are all the attacks. I think, what did I say? I think there's 23 different attacks, starting at about 26th Street, coming all the way down to Fulton Street. You can see where just to give you a sense of where this is, the World Trade Center's ground zero. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 right around in that area. So each one was supposed to carry and use his Greek fire vials. That was a great story about that too. Whenever they picked it up from the guy at Greenwich Village, he put them all into a valise. And so the guy, Headley, picked up the valise, and 144 vials of combustible material is heavy. And so he's walking along and then has to put it down every so often. And so, here's a guy walking, carrying a heavy valise. He gets on a streetcar, which of course in those days were horse-drawn, and he accidentally heads south. He heads south instead of north to where the Central Park where they were staying. And somebody has to tell him, he starts noticing the numbers weren't right or something. He has to ask somebody, I'm going to Central Park. Am I going the right? No, you got to get on another car to go north. One of the vials leaked. One of the corks popped open, and it started smelling. Luckily, it didn't start burning, but it started smelling, and somebody said, there's something dead in that valise. What are you carrying? He said, well, don't worry about it. And got on another car heading north. So 21 different hotels were targeted. All were below 26th and Broadway. At that point, that was the northern edge of New York City's major business district. Now, how many people have been to Manhattan? Now the central business area is like 51st Street, 50th Street. That's where most of the big buildings are. There was very little north of 26th Street, so they came down this way. Most of them were clustered around City Hall. Only one was a residential hotel, and for some reason, one hay barge was targeted. Barnum's Museum was the only commercial building that was targeted. And the interesting thing about Barnum's Museum, Cobb Kennedy was the one that did that, and he did it in the stairwell, and he did one thing right. He did throw it down, and it flamed up, but Barnum's people put it out pretty quickly. A few days later, P.T. Barnum, always the showman, always the promoter, put out a big ad. He says, well, after the big New York City attack on all our hotels, you notice that my museum did not catch fire and burn. It burned the next year. Interesting thing, just probably coincidence. The Winter Garden Theater was nearby to where Edwin Booth, Junius Booth, and John Wilkes Booth were all playing Julius Caesar. It was the only night that all three of them played in the same play. So once the word got out that some of these rooms were smoldering, Police Superintendent John Kennedy now knew that the Canadian tips were accurate, and he ordered officers and firemen to all the hotels to check the rooms for fires. So only in one place did the fires really start a little bit, and they was quickly put out. Now, the city's 4,000 volunteer firemen helped police warn the hotels, but they were not needed to fight the fires. These guys would not have been able to put out the fires. In those days, go back a second. In those days, firefighting was kind of like a mixture of Kiwanis Club and a drinking club. And sometimes you got to fight fires. They still liked to use the old-time pump fire engines, even though the steam-powered fire engine had been around for 10 or 15 years. These guys liked to do this just to prove how strong they were. And then when another fire company would show up, they would often get in fist fights over who had the rights to put out the fire because they got some money for putting out the fire. So they would often cut the hoses of rival fire departments or fire departments. This was not a professional fire department. It was probably the least professional fire department in all of the Northeast. Okay, why didn't the fires catch? Already touched on that. Two guys never showed up. There were 8 of them. 2 of them never showed up. They chickened out at the last minute. They were supposed to have left the hotel windows closed. There should have been plenty of oxygen in the room. So the Confederates never tested it. But my chemist friend said, oh yeah, that stuff would have worked had they only used it properly. Okay, next one. Said very little damage was done. Most fires never got beyond the smoldering stage because they were discovered by hotel staff. But had they done it correctly, this would have been a major disaster. New York City might still be a broad spot of woods on the river, because New York City had suffered devastating fires in 1776, 1835, and 1845, which dozens of city blocks burned. Those were single source fires. The Confederates had 144 vials, but they only targeted 21 different hotels. 1776 fire started in a tavern. The 1835 fire started in a dry goods store. Okay, you can move along. Yeah, this is an interesting one. Whale oil. Is there a whale oil stores anywhere in Wilmington now? I don't think so. But whale oil apparently is very destructive, and it actually created an explosion. Now in doing the research for this, I started thinking about, is there anything else that the Confederates could have done that would have been as destructive or more destructive? And I found something. They never looked for much better targets. And clustered in today's meatpacking and arts districts along 11th Avenue between 20th and 10th Street, there's a camphorine distillery, turpentine distillery, 13 lumber yards, wooden warehouses filled with goods on the Hudson, an unspecified chemical factory, but the best target at all was the Manhattan Gas Works. Probably at some point here, all of you have said, I am being cheated by my gas company or my electric company. There's no way my bill could be as big as it is. Everybody has thought that, right? Or said it, complained about it. The Manhattan Gas Works, I found letters to the editor of all of the newspaper that says, the Manhattan Gas Works is overcharging us. There's just no way I'm using that much whale oil or coal gas to light my lamps. And so the Manhattan Gas Works had this brilliant PR idea of inviting the public down to show them how they distill coal into coal gas. And so they worked through the entire process and published this in a newspaper. And in one part of the newspaper, it talks about how, the most dangerous part of this operation is controlling the pressure in all of the lines. Because in those days, you would have gas lines that would go into every house, every hotel room, and you would light it, and then you wouldn't blow it out. You'd have to turn off the gas. One of the things about the hotels was every hotel room had Jimmy marks on the door, because when an out-of-towner, some country bumpkin came into town, we come in and blow out the gas and then go to sleep and asphyxiate himself. So instead of turning off the gas, they're blowing it out like you blow out a candle. And so they would control the pressure going into all of the buildings and the houses. They had giant steel tanks floating on water. So whenever you wanted to increase the amount of gas going into every house, you would lower the level in the bigger tank, and then that would lower that. Or if you wanted to, I'm getting the opposite. If you wanted more gas, you'd lower the level. If you wanted less gas, you would raise the level. All the Confederates would have had to have done is blow up those tanks that regulate the pressure. They would have started 100,000 fires by whenever somebody would go in to light their gas lamp, and it shoot up into the ceiling and set fire to the ceiling. This is this actually Gas Works covered like about 10 city blocks. Yeah, I've gotten ahead of myself here. The gas works were dangerous. They blew up all the time. The Manhattan Gas Works never did blow up, but certainly they did in other towns. This is a picture of one. Yeah, one back up a little bit. This is a picture of one, I think, in New Haven, Connecticut, where the gas works actually blew up. So they were not uncommon. Okay. So we could have had a number of things happen. Confederates could have started 144 separate fires just using their vials. And had they waited for a windy night, it was 10 miles an hour flowing from west to east that night. If they'd scouted and targeted those more vulnerable west side targets, attacked early in the morning when the firemen would have all been at bed asleep or drunk. The only water source, the Cropan Reservoir, 42nd and 6th Avenue. Does anybody recognize that address? That's where the New York City Public Library is today. So all of the water that was needed for the city of New York was kept by an above-ground reservoir. It was 16 blocks of the first fire. So the first 3 hotels were all targeted. Had those 3 fires if it fought at the same time, water pressure would have dropped off. The fire hydrants from City Hall were all old and fed from much smaller pipes. So they were less useful if water reached them at all. Said the 4,000 volunteer fire department were certainly not centrally dispatched or controlled. So if one department heard about a fire, it would ring the bell, not necessarily warn anybody else and try and get to it. It just wasn't as modern as it could have been. But had just three hotels caught fire, they'd have used up all the water. And there would have been no water to fight the fires for all of those other hotels south of there. So New York City would definitely have burned. Okay, one more. You see, this is a later image. So you see the more modern steam-powered fire engine there, but they're still using the pump. So what happened after this? McMaster, in his own newspaper, part of the plotters speculated that Lincoln had set the fires in retaliation for not winning New York City's votes in 1860 and 64. The most remarkable thing, he then wondered in print if Confederates from Kentucky were to blame. 4 of them were from Kentucky. You know, why would he even tip off that? He knew what was going on. General Dix ordered troops to chase the conspirators into Canada. And Lincoln said, you know, what? I am not invading Canada. So he had to rush some sort of couriers to stop United States troops from invading Canada, chasing these Confederate conspirators. So, but Lincoln didn't control Police Superintendent Kennedy. So he sent detectives to Toronto to find the Confederates. And he identified all of them with the help of a drunken conspirator, probably Kennedy. Or Kennedy was at least fingered by another drunk. So he was captured in Michigan. He got on a train bound for Michigan, and the detectives got boarded with him. And one of the conspirators was with him, and he jumped off into a snowbank and got away. Kennedy was caught. So Kennedy was tried. It was the travesty of justice, really. Kennedy was tried by military prosecution. He did admit he was in New York City at the time, but he said, I was on vacation while waiting for a ship to carry him south. They did not even call the hotel clerk to ID Kennedy as the drunk he had thrown out of his hotel for loudly defending secession. So once again, this is the guy that he's not the type of spy that you want on your team. He's in New York City defending secession. So he's tried by a military tribunal. And another thing that Kennedy sent McMaster, Representative Wood, and several of the Copperheads letters said, you don't know me, but could you help make bail on the charge I tried to burn down the city of New York? You know, how could he have known those men unless he did know them? You know, this is a guy that has no contact with McMaster, has never met Representative Woods, and yet he sends them letters. So he knew who they were, they knew who he was, but those guys they got off. Even McMaster got off without arrest. Kennedy was executed at Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor. That's underneath the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. If you know where Fort Hamilton is, Fort Lafayette was right across, not too far from it. Colonel Martin was arrested a few months later, but for reasons that are again curious, the prosecutors are very lackluster in pursuing him. And a New York City judge says, if you guys don't want to prosecute him, I'm going to kick him loose. So here's a guy that pretty much everybody knows is part of the conspiracy they let him go. He lived in Brooklyn, sold tobacco, international tobacco exporter, and he's buried in Brooklyn. Kennedy returned to Kentucky, and he became the Attorney General of the state. He was never arrested, and he wrote his book in 1905. I couldn't ever find where the New York Times even mentioned it, even though it was all about their city. Even though he accused 2 New York City congressmen and the state's governor of complicity. That would be the type of thing a New York City newspaper would have covered and should have covered, but they did not pay any attention to it. Now, one final thought. Richard Montgomery was a spy who tipped the War Department off that New York City was going to be attacked in November 1864. He was the same man who testified at the Lincoln assassination trial in May 1865 that Jefferson Davis ordered Lincoln's death. His testimony was ruled as unreliable. So I've always wondered, how could Montgomery be right about the assassination or the attack on New York City, but wrong about the Lincoln assassination? So we'll never know if Davis actually had a hand in that or not, but Montgomery certainly thought he did. Well, that's the presentation. Anybody got questions on it? Byron.
The guy that got hung in the end, I forget what you said at the beginning. Had he been in the Army? Was he a soldier or what?
Robert Cobb Kennedy?
Yeah,
he was a soldier, but he was from a Louisiana regiment. He got wounded, sent to a prison camp up north, and he escaped and went into Canada. And so he was just hanging around in Toronto. Why they brought him into the conspiracy when everybody else was from the same regiment? They were all 2nd Kentucky Cavalry, I believe. So it's just a mystery that we'll never know the answer to.
He got the rap in the end.
It's what?
He got the rap in the end.
Yeah. He was part of it, but they didn't have any evidence against him. And so they just needed to hang somebody, and he happened to be the one they caught at the time. But then after it was over, they arrested Martin, who was the head of it all, and they didn't do anything with him. Yes.
Why do you think they picked Cincinnati instead of Philadelphia?
Why didn't they do Cincinnati?
No, I wonder why Cincinnati was one of the cities.
I don't know. Yeah, relatively minor city at the time. No idea. But that was just one of the cities that they mentioned at the time. But I do have a story about this. I did this program when the book came out, and I did a program at City College in New York, which is right downtown Manhattan. And after, it's a couple of hundred people there, and after it was over, this very straight-up military-looking guy comes up to me and says, "I'm Colonel Brown of the Homeland Security." I said, "Yeah, what do you need with me?" And he said, "I just want you to know we teach your book to all of our students." And I said, "What do you mean you teach it?" He says, "Because you make the point that the local officials ignored the rumors that a terrorist attack will happen or could happen." He said the federal government warned everybody in New York City that it was going to happen, it could happen, and they all ignored them. He says, so that's the point that we try and make, because his students were police chiefs and fire chiefs and all that sort of stuff, all in the New York City area. And they said, so what we tell them is if you hear something, you act on it. If you hear a rumor, you try and track down that rumor, because in this case, the rumors were dead on accurate, and nobody believed it. But there's nothing like standing there and some guy from the Homeland Security wants to talk to you. So I did miss an opportunity there. I should have made a deal with him to come up to New York City and speak to him every so often. So I could have gotten some free trips to New York and go see some Broadway plays back when New York was a lot safer than it is today. But I said, this had New York City been destroyed, and it could have been destroyed either by the Confederates accurately doing it or by blowing up the gas works, it would have been an economic disaster for the United States, just as it is today. New York City was the financial brain center for the nation. That they had the stock exchange, and every bank would exchange notes. And this is long before computers, but some bank in Buffalo or Indiana would send in paper, and they'd exchange it, and that bank would send off paper. All of this stuff was just kept in wooden drawers in all these banks in New York City. If all that stuff was destroyed, think of the millions of dollars that would have gone up in smoke. And with the fires had spread from the Hudson all the way over to the East River, you'd had people jumping into the East River trying to get away from flames. And so, no way to properly estimate it, but 800,000 people, I would think at least half of them probably would have died in the middle of the night just trying to get away. And there's no way they could have put those fires out because they didn't have enough water. There were not enough boats to evacuate everybody. It would have been the worst disaster in American history as far as terrorism goes. Yes, ma'am.
Was the Greek fire expensive to buy?
Was what?
Was the Greek fire?
Oh, no. It's just a matter of putting chemicals together, and chemicals anybody could obtain. And the fascinating thing is that they still they haven't been able to duplicate the original Greek fire from the 7th century. If that painting is accurate about throwing it out. Now we have flamethrowers, but the flamethrowers, have all sorts of pressurized stuff that they wouldn't have had. They still haven't figured out, is that a real depiction or was it just a story? But the Greek fire that I showed my buddy, my high school friend, he says, oh yeah, that stuff will instantly go up from exposure to oxygen. But that was the key, instant exposure to oxygen, not pouring it out. Yes.
So as a journalist and historian, would you give us a sense of what the freedom of press was like then versus now? There's much political vitriol in press now as there was then, but I was surprised at your mention of an editor getting into legal trouble over his.
Lincoln was really pretty big on imprisoning editors he didn't like, and he did it to scores of editors all over the Northeast. So you took your chances if you went against the Lincoln administration. And McMaster did his time in prison, and he said it embittered him. And but I still can't. Whenever I was in the New York City Public Library, I said, I wonder how all the newspapers covered this. And most of them only mentioned it for a few days. But you would think that this would be big news, and it wasn't. It was because it didn't happen, I guess, is one reason. But when I was reading McMaster's say, well, I think Lincoln probably sent men over here to do it. And if he didn't, maybe it was somebody from Kentucky. And when I read, wait a minute, nearly all of the guys are from Kentucky. Why would you come up with Kentucky as an example of some of the conspirators? That was just wildly inappropriate for a part of the conspiracy to be essentially, here's some guys to go look at. But all of them got away, all of them got away, and then Kennedy was the only one that essentially got caught with the goods at the time. Then the only other one arrested was Martin. And I don't even remember if Headley names the other people. But Thompson, the head of the Secret Service, he got away to England, and when he got back, he helped found the American Telephone and Telegraph Company. He had a lot of money somehow coming back from England, and it's always suspicion that he took a lot of Confederate gold with them and kept it. And he came back, was one of the early investors of AT&T. So sometimes it pays to be in good government positions. Okay, anything else? All right, well, I appreciate you having me down tonight.
Thank you so much. On behalf of our roundtable, would you accept this gift?
Okay.
We have an artist, Jim Fortin, among us.
All right, well,
There he
thank you.
is. And this is a print of one of his works.
All right, good, appreciate it.
Thank you all. See you in November.
Okay. And I do have a few books back here if any of you care. I think I'm still going to cut my copies of